talk show king to hear about his star-studded career, as well as the more private side of Michael Parkinson.
Interviewing Michael Parkinson on television is like cooking lunch for Jamie Oliver or giving a lift in your car to Lewis Hamilton.
I'm very excited to be here.
Are you?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's you.
Between 1971 and 2007, his late-night talk show was the place where the celebrities of three generations, from Muhammad Ali and Betty Davis to David Beckham and Tony Blair, told their stories.
Oh, I didn't know you were a journalist. How dreary.
Now, in an autobiography called Parky, he's told his own story, the cricket-obsessed Yorkshire boyhood, military service in the Suez Crisis, and his early career as a newspaper and TV reporter, during which his 50-year marriage to Mary began. He's retired from talk shows, but now returns to the format in the other chair.
Doctors famously make bad patients. Are you a reluctant interviewee, or are you relieved to be able to put your side of it?
I love seeing the other fella sweat. No. I mean, I think that interviewers are actually very friendly people to interview because they realize and understand the job you have. And you realize more than anything else that the secret to a good interview is a consensuality, basically. That if one doesn't want to play, then let's all go home. So you'll find me putty in your hands.
I have to say, well, we'll talk about some of the cases later where people didn't want to play. But the big technical question is, in chat shows, is the balance between the interviewer and the guest. And that has changed substantially over the last 30, 40 years, hasn't it, from you to Jonathan Ross, say?
Yes, I mean, what's shifted is the emphasis from the interviewer to the guy who's the kind of the feed to the comedian, and also the second banana, if you like. I mean, it's a comedy show now, talk shows on television. I mean, it's always been like that. I mean, you go back to the history of the talk show, the Americans have always favoured that kind of approach, where the host himself is the man with a loud personality, often a stand-up comic, and the rest are merely players in that scenario. Mine was a different one. I'd followed the tradition of, say, David Frost. So it was a conversational talk show, basically, and that's gone. I mean, I don't bewail the fact that it's gone, except to say that I like watching them as well as doing them.
The other big changes in the chat show in the time you did it, which are quite clear, first of all, is the PR industry, the way in which that has changed. It'd be impossible now to reproduce the way in which those huge American stars would come and spend an hour with you. It's all now, isn't it? They're there to sell something, or they're tightly controlled.
They always were, Mark, you know. They always were. There's a kind of mythology about the 70s that James Cagney and Fred Astaire came on because they loved me. They didn't. They came on because they had something to flog. It might be that we disguised it better. They were more reticent about plugging than they are nowadays. It might be that they had less of a PR force behind them, forcing them into that situation. But it was always there. I mean, it's a trade-off, a talk show. It's a trade-off that I'll mention your book, I'll mention your film, if you come and give me an hour of your time. It's not a bad trade-off either. I mean, you know, you got an hour with Bing Crosby, and all you have to do is mention the film he's in. Come on. I mean, otherwise it would cost you about 800,000 quid. You know, so that's there. I mean, I think the big difference is now that with the what's different, in fact, is that the stars in those days were unused to television as such. I mean, the 70s, I got that wonderful period where those great stars who had hitherto only been seen as 30-foot images on the screen were released from the studio because the studio system collapsed, and into television they came for the very first time. And there was something about that. When you said, ladies and gentlemen, Fred Astaire, and he was standing there, and said, gosh, that's Fred Astaire. Now, there's nobody today, I don't think, nobody that will get that kind of response. Because the multiplicity of the medium, basically, as well. And the very word celebrity demeans the offering, in a sense, doesn't it? You know, it's a derogatory word now, isn't it? In saying star is a better word, but who would you call star now? This is the thing. No, I had the best of it. I really did have the best of it. And I was very grateful because all those people that I interviewed, that I called on and came to the show, were my heroes.
The thing that struck me in the book, which I haven't understood at all, and this is what I mean about the way in which the level of control has changed, is the one of the famous Ali interviews, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but it turns out in your book that he was over to promote a soft drink somewhere, and you said to them, can we have him for 5 minutes? And in fact, you kept him for an hour, and it became a famous program. Now, that wouldn't happen now, would it? Because you'd have huge pictures of the soft drink behind you, and there'd be people timing it and saying, we said 5 minutes, we said 5 minutes. That is a big shift.
I think that's absolutely true. It was a much more innocent time in those days. And of course, I mean, that first interview, I mean, people weren't quite aware. I wasn't quite aware of what this man was. I mean, we knew he was a fair fighter. We knew he had a big mouth, but we didn't know that he could actually sit for an hour and entrance an audience, hypnotize them. I didn't know that. I doubt that when we sat down with him that we'd planned an hour. Maybe we'd thought 40 minutes, we'll put somebody else on the top of that show and send it out. I mean, he talked forever. It was brilliant, wonderful, amazing. He was sat there thinking, my word, aren't I lucky?
What about the poetry? Was that your idea?
Well, yes. When I fought Archie Moore, I wrote a poem. I said, when you come to the fight, don't block the aisles and don't block the door, for you all may go home after round 4.
The other thing that struck me in the book is that your childhood, it's incredibly vivid account in this book. The pit ponies coming up with their eyes bandaged because they've never seen the light. Very intense details right through. Were there notebooks, diaries, or is that all memory?
A lot of it's memory, and a lot was contained in the book my mother wrote when my father died, which I didn't find until after she had died. She wrote it because she couldn't handle the grief of my father's death. So she found a sensible way for her, rounded up. That's recalling the life they had together. And it was a revelation to me because I had such an extraordinary, cosseted, happy childhood that I never contemplated the fact that they were dirt poor, and they were. And her account of how they tried to keep things together and the lockouts and all that, my father being locked out of the pit on the miners, was extraordinary, you know. And you realise then the kind of background you came from, which had been hid from you by loving parents. It was extraordinary.
But there's another detail. I wonder about the you say very secure childhood, but there's another amazing detail in the book where the siren goes off at the pit, which means that there's been a serious accident and very possibly someone has died. And you say your mother looks up from her ironing in the direction of the pit. But were you aware of the level of danger, the fact that your father was in danger?
Well, I knew it wasn't. I knew it had its dangers. I mean, you saw occasionally the consequences of that. I mean, there's a friend of mine called Brian Cope who lost his leg down the pit. And I always remember that because he used to turn up for our football team playing with his tin leg. I mean, but, you know, and he was quite unself-conscious about it. And it's the first time that I understood what might happen in this dangerous industry. But on the other hand, you didn't have personal fear. You didn't have the fear that you're going to go out and be beaten up by somebody or knifed by somebody or some creepy guy would come and take you into the woods. It didn't, you know, we're a gang of people and we lived a life of intense and wonderful freedom. And that's what I remember most of all about my childhood, being free. You know, I'd leave home at weekends. I would come back for about 8 hours, 9 hours. And when you were coming home, you would hear everybody had a different call. You hear these whistles going on, and that the different tone of whistle would indicate a different child was required back home. And it was extraordinary. And it was. I look back with it. I wouldn't alter a line of it. I really wouldn't.
You once scored. This is extraordinary. This 2,023 not out.
And we stopped counting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh right. Across a single week.
I mean, listen, it's not out. That's very important. Well, we used to play under the street lamps. You know. I mean, that's all we did was play football and cricket and the streets every single day. You know. And I did. You know, this wonderful score, my mates, and in the end I ended up without anybody to bowl at me. I mean, that was the thing, they all went home early. I couldn't get any practice at all.
The other thing that struck me in the book is that a lot of people fantasize about having played professionally. Now, you could have done it, it's almost certain. You were good enough, clearly, at one point. Is there any part of you that...
nostalgia for that, lost ambition?
Yeah.
I suppose so. I mean, when I was younger, I certainly dreamed of playing cricket for a living. I wasn't really good enough. I would have been an ordinary county professional at best, and now would probably have a sweet shop in Barnsley or somewhere like that, you know. So I'm glad that I wasn't good enough. But yes, I mean, any boy who was born in Yorkshire had as his heritage and ambition to play county cricket for Yorkshire, because in those days, you remember, you had to be born in Yorkshire to play for Yorkshire. It was the most exclusive cricket club in the world. So to be part of that, it was even more important than winning an England cap. My father was cricket man. Cricket defined my father. If he found somebody who didn't know about the game, he was lost for words. He had nothing to tell us, to talk to them about. And everything that we ever did was about cricket. Our holidays, he went to those seaside resorts that are the best beaches for cricket. I mean,
Well, there's a photograph in the book of, I think, the first few minutes on holiday, and you and your dad, you've got a cricket bat, and you're walking out onto the beach.
When we went to holiday to Scarborough, if you looked at our luggage, you'd thought with the MCC team going to the West Indies. I mean, there weren't sort of buckets and spades. There were stumps and bats and wicket-keeping gloves and things like that. We were fully equipped. So it was a serious business.
Your father wanted you to play for, at least for Yorkshire, probably for England as well. And it could have happened in the days when you were playing with Dickie Bird, Geoffrey Boycott.
Well, not really. I mean, we played Yorkshire League cricket, which is tough cricket, and we were all young men, and Dickie and I used to open for Yorkshire, and this young lad came in with the national spectacles and called Geoffrey Boycott, and eventually, you know, became this great player. And we'd sit at the end of day's play Saturday at Shaw Lane and look down over Barnsley and talk, the three of us, about our ambitions. They're all the same. The difference was that Dickie and I hoped and prayed we might play for Yorkshire. Geoffrey Boycott knew he would play for Yorkshire. And more than that, he knew he would play for England as well. I mean, my father dreamed. It's an exaggeration to say he thought I was a failure. Of course he didn't. But there's a bit in my father which actually thought, no, you could have done better.
The other thing I had always thought was an exaggeration when you told the story or written about it, which was about him kidnapping Mary when she was first pregnant and taking her to Yorkshire, because we should explain it's all changed now, but in those days, to play for Yorkshire, you had to have been born in Yorkshire. Right. But he really did kidnap her and take her back to Yorkshire.
He did. I'd moved from the Guardian down to Daily Express in London. I was living in a seedy flat in Bayswater, and the phone went, and I picked it up and made down, and he sent me a few words. He said, "Job's done." I said, "What job is that?" He said, "I moved Mary." I said, "From where?" He said, "From Manchester to Yorkshire." I said, "What's that for?" He said, "Well," he said, "the lad, when he's born," he said, "if he's born in Lancashire, he can't play for Yorkshire." And I said, "Dad, suppose it was a girl." He said, "Don't talk bloody daft." And of course, there was born my first child, a son. And as I say in the book, it didn't matter because he adored his granddad and was adored in return. So
your attitude to your parents, it's such a loving book about them, which is quite rare, because as you know from all the people you've interviewed, a lot of people who succeed, they've done it despite their parents, and they hate their parents, they're abandoned by their parents. You're very unusual. It's an absolute portrait of your love for them and theirs for you.
I hope so. That was one of the main reasons for writing the book, in a sense, to actually tell a story that had a happy childhood, that shows that you can actually come from something different other than that awful sort of angst that some people have.
They were desperate in the way that lots of parents in mining communities were. They were both desperate that you would not go down the pit.
Yes, my father particularly. He didn't want it. It was a very strange time, because up until that point, all my family had gone down the pit because they had to go down the pit. I mean, they'd leave school. My dad left school at 12 and went down the pit. His dad before him was exactly the same, and his dad before him. My granddad was the first literate member of our family. If we go through our family records, he was the first one who wrote didn't sign it with an X, the parish register. So I was going to go the same way, except for the Butler Education Act, which came in and freed bright working class kids like myself and gave us a chance. When I started this book, I couldn't actually find the beginning. And I knew that until I got that, I couldn't start properly. And then I remembered, I said to myself, why didn't I become a miner? And I remember him taking me down the pit when I was about 13 or 14 and showed me the reality of it. Seams, low seams and all that. And coming back with me and not saying a word until we got to our house. And then he said to me, "What do you reckon?" And I said, "Well, not for 100 quid a shift." And he said to me, "I agree with you. So what I want you to say," he said, "but I have to tell you that if ever I see you at the pit gates, I'll kick your ass all the way home." and then I put down this sentence. I don't know why it was, but I put down, "This is the story of a boy who did as he was told." I thought, that's it. And away you go. Interesting.
Well, the educational aspect is interesting. I mean, compared, say, to Melvyn Bragg, who had similar background, grammar school, but then Oxford and so on,
BBC, you pretty much threw away your education.
Well, I did. I hated Barnsley Grammar School. I was quite a bright kid. I got put in the express class based on my entrance examination results, and that meant I had 3 languages, and I had to do the school certificates. It was in those days in 4 years instead of 5. But we didn't get on. I just didn't get on with Barnsley Grammar School. I mean, I'm part of the blame, and they're part of the blame. I didn't like some of those old geezers who've been brought back during the war, to the old Victorian people, teachers, to teachers. And I was constantly either fighting them or frightened of them.
We talked about you being very Yorkshire and a Yorkshire boyhood, to take that title. But the influence of America was interesting to me from very early on, both through the movies but also through literature.
Yes.
Very young, you're reading Steinbeck, Hemingway.
John Dos Passos,
Yeah.
Scott Fitzgerald. In those days, England was drab. England was awful. It was like living under a big grey blanket. Culture in every other way. And we got our culture, my generation got our culture from listening to AFN, American Forces Network. We heard jazz for the first time. And from Hollywood. That's where we got it from. That's how we grew up with those influences. And I don't actually for 1 minute regret that. It's been a very rich part of my life.
But even at Barnsley Grammar, Steinbeck was controversial.
He was, yeah. I mean, I was in a free period once, and I was reading Steinbeck, Grips of Wrath, and I remember this man, I think his name was Smith, and he was one of those old teachers who'd been brought in, wandering around, and he sort of picked it up and said, "What's this?" He knew damn well what it was. It was a free period. We were allowed to read what we were. And I said, it's called The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck. And he said to me, Mike, it's rubbish and obscene, and sort of dropped it on the floor. And I looked at him, I thought, you twerp. I mean, you fool. I mean, why do you do that, And it was just another sort of idea, or indication, rather, kind of separation between me and them.
Were they disappointed, your parents, that you'd got to 2 O-levels and left school at 16?
No, my mother was, my dad didn't. My dad was more disappointed that I didn't play for Yorkshire. I mean, he didn't really bother about that at all. I mean, it's all right saying, well, go to grammar school. You don't go down the pit. But where do you go? What do you do? And my mother was very upset when I did leave home. I mean, I remember that. I remember, saying, you're going to Doncaster. And she gave me these blankets. I was going to the South Pole. And I said, Mother, it's 12 miles down the road. My dad said, you can't play for Barnsley. I said, no, I can play for Donny, but they hadn't thought it through. Nor had I. I mean, I got no idea the adventure I was on.
The determination from very young to be a journalist, though, what had that come from?
Well, there's 2 things. Well, one movies. I mean, there was that element of romantic desire, because I saw Bogey, with all those hold the front page and all that stuff. They used to wear a ticket in a hat and a trophy and the belted raincoat.
And you used to ring the operator
I did.
from
I did.
public phone booths.
In those days, of course, we didn't have a telephone, so probably when I get in there and I put the thing up there and I say, she said, yes, love, what number do you want? I said, Kevin, I said, it's just she said, bugger off, you silly old sod, But it was all daft, it was, but I mean, eventually, but the other thing that was dreamland. But the practicality of being a journalist, of furthering my ambition, was much nearer to home, because my father was captain of the local cricket team, and every Monday, this guy used to arrive on his big rally bicycle and get the cricket results from my father for the local paper. And I thought that'd be a hell of a job, collecting sports results for the rest of my life. It'd be a wonderful job. And so I that was my first idea I got, that I could start there. And indeed I did. When I left school at 16, I got a job working with a man who came to our house, a very good journalist called Stan Bristow, who taught me the rudiments of the game, the correct way to be a journalist. I mean, I was full of fantasy. I used to write wedding reports in the style of Ernest Hemingway. It was a very good day for a wedding. It was a very good day. It was it. And he'd say, come here. What's that, he'd say, But he showed me patiently how to be that person, and how to do shorthand and all that sort of stuff, So that I had a very wonderful grounding. And most importantly of all, what it did tell me was that dream job that I'd imagined in my mind wasn't at all like the reality. The reality of journalism is a slog. It's about a routine.
But also, which you write about very powerfully in the book, of deaths, of having to go and talk to people whose relatives have just died. In one case, actually breaking the news.
That's right. That was a terrible mistake. We got I don't know how the mistake happened, but I knocked on this woman's door to ask her about the death of her son, and she came, this very nice woman, and said, yes, can I help you? And I said, I've come about your son. And she said, what about my, oh my God, oh jeez. And I had to tell her, and we got the neighbour in and all that. And it was awful. And I went to bed for a day and a half. But what I'm saying to you is that now Bogey never did that in the movies I saw. So I soon understood that this was a serious occupation, that it was different. But I still enjoyed it. That was the point.
The newspaper career was interrupted by Suez. Now, this is a side that amazed me reading the book, so I really didn't know this. Although you were put into the PR side of it, which seems easy, you came under fire. I mean, your life was at risk.
Yes, we were. We landed in Suez with the advanced party of journalists who were put in charge of the press corps who were to cover it. And it was a cock-up from beginning to end. I mean, I'd left a local newspaper to go into national service. But it was fascinating for me because for the very first time, I mean, I found out what it was like to be in a war, which wasn't very pleasant. And then I discovered more than that. I found the journalists who were in an altogether different league than I'd imagined or seen before. I wanted to be like they were.
But it got very nasty at one point. I mean, there was a moment where you could have been killed by a mob.
Oh, well, the United Nations came in, were sent in to keep the peace, and I had a jeep load of, of photographers, and I had this driver, and we were driving through the back of this United Nations parade going through the streets, and the mob were out, and the mob in an intersection closed like that, so we came between us and the parade, and it was nasty. I mean, they started rocking it, and I got these 4 guys in the back, and I got a little pistol in my holster, like a cowboy.
Did you know how to use it?
Oh, certainly. You point and pull the trigger. I mean, whether I hit anything, I don't know. But I mean, well, that's what you didn't want to do, is to inflame the mob anymore. And my driver, who'd done a bit of time actually for assault and things, and it was a regular. I mean, he got out of the car. And he went up to the guy, the leader, and he threatened him with physical violence. And I thought, this is the time they tipped the car over. This is one of the time we've all had it. And strangely enough, there was something about his manner. He had mad eyes and they pulled apart and we drove through. And he said, but I've saved your life.
And then after Suez, back into newspapers, it seems astonishing now. Doncaster, I should say, when you went there, a 5-newspaper town.
Yeah, it was. It had a press corps of about 40 or 50 people. It was a wonderful town to work. It really was. It was just full of journalists. And of course, it was a stepping stone to Manchester, where they published in those days. All the Nationals had their office as well. So,
well, and the Manchester Guardian.
And the Manchester Guardian, which is where I very luckily ended up through a chance meeting with a wonderful man called Dick West. And that was my university. I was terrified of it, because the first person I met there was this tall, languid, arrogant boy who said, my name's Frayne, Michael Frayne. And I thought, well, God, what a posh thing you are. You know? And Anthony Howard had just joined too, and so Dick West and all those people were there. And I was the only guy who could do shorthand, apart from another guy called Joe Minogue. So we were kind of the sort of the working gun dogs to all these pedigrees, you know.
Did you feel chippy, as they say?
I did. I felt very chippy, and I used to have rows with Tony Howard particularly. He used to call me the Barnsley Clodpole. They used to call him that stuck-up twat, I used to call him, frankly. So we had that sort of thing went on. But, it wasn't nasty, not at all. And they were wonderful people to work with.
Something else that happened in Doncaster was a play by Ben Travers. Ben Travers later to be a guest on Parkinson.
Very much so, yes.
In fact, but he'd written a play called Thark. And you took a young lady there.
I took my wife there.
Well, she wasn't your wife then, was she?
No, she was not. She was Mary Agnes Hennigan, she was in those days. School teacher of that parish. And I took her there and showed off immensely. I mean, I wanted to be, to understand that I was a very serious journalist and what's more, very cultured, and that I was witty too.
But in your spell when you were becoming a theatre critic, it hasn't happened to many drama reviewers this. You were challenged to a duel by an actor.
I wrote a scathing piece about a local repertory group in Doncaster, and a man who I'd criticised he had a shop which dealt in old instruments, old weapons, and he came standing outside the street in Scotland in Doncaster with a cutlass in his hand, challenging me to a duel. Now, I said to my editor, he wants locking up, and he said, no, go and get a sword. He said, go and fight him. I mean, this was, daft, but it was, local favours were interesting in those days.
The nearest you come to confessional section in the book is about drinking too much when you were at the Daily Express, but it seems to have got pretty bad then.
Well, it got worse later. I mean, we have to understand that we're talking now about a culture of booze. I mean, to have worked in Fleet Street as a teetotaler, you'd have been a very lonely man indeed. And you'd been a very suspect guy too. I mean, the Daily Express, when I joined it, was the most popular newspaper in Britain, and it was a glamorous paper and all that. But at 5 o'clock, it was not unusual to have a fight in the reporter's room or anything like that when we got back from the pub. We got back from the pub at 5. Now, you're expected to do that. I mean, that was what it was all about. And after the shine had worn off me becoming a feature writer there, because there were 30 feature writers on the Express at that time, you were left to your own devices. You'll collect your money in the morning, you'd float, you'd go up to the pub, and you'd stay there until they sent for you. Now, often they didn't send for you for years. We had one feature writer, who didn't write a piece for 3.5 years. He just stood in the pub for 3.5 years and sort of carried him out. And so I got a bit like that. I mean, I joined. I've always liked drinking. I've always liked pubs. And so I became that person. I wasn't the only one. We were all like that. And it led to me becoming kind of morose and unhappy. And Mary pulled me up about it. But, I mean, it was an ongoing thing. I mean, similarly, when I went into television again, I mean, even though Granada was a dry ship, I mean, it was only a dry ship in Granada. I mean, outside, our Studio 3 was a pub. The person would ring your secretary and she'd say, well, he's in Studio 3. It was a pub. I mean, that's where we did all our work. That's where we went. And I know of people, I mean, I've never did it myself, but who could not get on air unless they drank half a bottle of whiskey. I mean, fortunately, it never affected my work. Fortunately, because then I was married to Mary, a woman of great good common sense, who constantly reminded me that, look, this is stupid, it's silly, because you're ugly when you're drunk and all that sort of thing. And she was right. But I remember Michael Caine saying that he never wanted to stop drinking altogether, or to be told to do so, because there are too many bottles of fine wine to be drunk. And I've always thought that's very good advice.